Okay. Well, for this last session, we're continuing on with information about ecosystem-based management, and we have our next speaker is Selina Heppell from the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, Oregon State University. She's had I haven't had a chance to meet her very often, but her reputation has certainly preceded her in my world, and I know that she's been very active on the SSC for the Pacific Council, and of course in this dimension she's been part of the working group that has led the development of the Fisheries Ecosystem Plan for the Pacific Council. So Selina, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Can you hear me okay? All right, I'll try not to. Usually I project too much, so if it gets loud, let me know. And people are still, I think Andre's still gathering people in. It's great to be here. I am a Seattle native, and in fact, my mom is here to hear my talk today. Now I'm on, that's right. More nervous than usual. Yeah, I grew up in Seattle. I went to Garfield High School, became a marine biologist there, got my bachelor's degree here in zoology. Oh. And now I'm Associate Department Head in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at OSU. We are the #2 fishery science program in the country. It's true. So it's great to be here with my colleagues at #1. And what I'm going to talk about today is my perspectives on the Magnuson-Stevens Act and how well or not it is protecting vulnerable species and habitats. And to start off, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about how I got here. I started off in high school here in Seattle wanting to talk to killer whales. And I actually did talk to killer whales and found I had no idea what they were saying. And moved from there to UC Santa Cruz and worked on elephant seals and population dynamics in the elephant seal recovery going on down in California. And moved from there into theoretical ecology, came back here to UW in the zoology department, took ecology from Bob Payne and Peter Kariva, and became excited about math, which I had, yes, which I had avoided at almost all costs prior to that. Became a quantitative conservation biologist in graduate school back in North Carolina, and started working on sea turtles. And so that was kind of my first link to fisheries, and discovered that actually I, for whatever reasons, appreciated being behind computers more than in the field, and ended up doing a lot of population modeling for sea turtle recovery plans. And ended up at OSU in a fisheries ecologist position and had to play catch up a bit so that I could sit at the table with all of the folks on the coast here who do the great work of fisheries stock assessment and population modeling here. So that's kind of my path to get here. So it's a little bit different from what a lot of stock assessors may, what their paths may have been. And I think that may give me a little bit of a perspective that's a bit different as far as the impacts of fisheries on ecosystems and how that kind of interplays, and how we might think about management strategies that assure sustainable fishing as well as healthy populations and habitats in the ecosystem. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about vulnerable species, vulnerable habitat, and I wanted to come back to the discussion that we ended with yesterday about the Endangered Species Act and tell you why I think it's not the best way to protect the most vulnerable species and habitats in the sea, and then we can come back to that discussion, and then ending with getting back to the Magnuson-Stevens Act. All right, so what makes a species vulnerable? Well, what I study primarily is life history evolution, and we have life history strategies that we can call slow and fast. And slow species have very low sustainable exploitation rates and are very slow to recover if we screw things up, okay? Fast species, though, are also vulnerable in many ways because they go through a lot of rapid changes regardless of how we're fishing them. And what that means is that they have rapid collapses potential in response to environmental change, and they can be highly unpredictable. Then we have a problem with insufficient biological information. And one of the problems that comes up is that many species don't conform to the rules of deterministic population growth and the simple constructs that we have that were originally developed prior to the advent of computers to try to figure out how many fish there are in the sea and how rapidly we can deplete them and where we should keep them in terms of biomass. And there are species that don't really follow those rules particularly well, and that can make it difficult to manage them. And then also one of the things that was sort of my mantra while working on the SSC is natural mortality is not a constant. Okay, and in fact, vital rates do change over time, particularly for species like forage species that are components of the ecosystem that have a lot of predation, and that predation changes over time. And so sometimes we don't have sufficient biological information to plug into the models, and that can potentially lead to a more vulnerable situation for a species because we don't really know how it's going to respond to fishing. Aggregation behaviors, clearly a species that aggregates predictably in space and time is potentially more vulnerable to overfishing. Extremely high or extremely low value, when a bluefin tuna can sell for $250,000, it might be profitable to fish the last one. But at the same time, very low value species may not be monitored particularly well, and so there may be some very low value species that could become vulnerable for that reason. And then finally, I think we do have an issue where species that occur largely outside of our exclusive economic zone and are potentially subject to fisheries management, or shall we say lack of fisheries management, could also potentially make them more vulnerable. Now, we talked a fair bit yesterday about mixed stock fisheries, and one of the issues with bycatch species generally is that it's very difficult to monitor them because the effort is generally not related to the catch, because the catch is for the target is a different species. So bycatch data, by its very nature, can be quite problematic to use to evaluate the status of one of these species. And we're probably unlikely to overfish a species that we're not targeting, but less attention to such species may lead to less data collection, and then who knows what happens after that. The barn door skate is an interesting example of this. We were talking about this species last night. The catch data, this is largely a bycatch species in the North Atlantic, and the catch data suggested that the biomass had gone through the floor, that it had basically collapsed. And it was petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. But then ultimately a little bit more work was done, more research, survey data was brought into play, and it was determined that that species was more productive than we thought and more widely distributed than we thought. So it's just an example of a situation where poor data can lead to a potentially an incorrect evaluation of the status of the stock. Now, a lot of the work I do is with bycatch of what we like to call the charismatic megafauna of the sea, the turtle, birds, and mammals. And lots of gear types interact with these species: trawls, gillnets, longlines, fixed gear, and so on. And the general problem is that not that the encounters are particularly high on an individual vessel basis, but that there's so many vessels and types of gear out there in the water. And so the cumulative impact of these gears can be quite high and has led to the endangerment of some species of sea turtles in particular. So let's just do a little history here, since that's part of why we're here. The bycatch of non-target species prior to 1996, we had the Endangered Species Act, really. The bycatch of threatened species was monitored fairly inconsistently from fishery to fishery. Then with the amendments of 1996, we have a lot of focus in those amendments on the large-scale drift net fisheries. The amendments aim to reduce non-target species catch and sets up the observer programs to monitor commercial bycatch. It was mostly aimed at non-target and overfished fish species, but also states the need to be in compliance with the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And then when we get to the 2006 amendments, we have the requirement for bycatch reduction programs to monitor non-target species and promote engineering of bycatch reducing gear. And the national standards and guidelines, National Standard 9, states that conservation and management measures shall, to the extent practicable, minimize bycatch and to the extent that bycatch can be avoided, minimize the mortality of such bycatch. And a lot of people get caught up on this term, extent practicable. What does that really mean? Now we have that term in there to provide the councils with some flexibility on these points. But that is a pretty wishy-washy term and leads to a lot of debate and discussion. And now sea turtles, since this is my pet taxa. Pre-1996, we did have the Endangered Species Act. Several species were listed. In fact, all species of sea turtles are listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened or endangered. And in 1987, you have the first turtle excluder device regulations in place for shrimp trawling in the Gulf of Mexico and the southeast US. Those of you who are familiar with it, this was an incredibly controversial and difficult exercise for the agency, for the fishermen that were involved, and so on. Ultimately, we ended up with devices that the fishermen designed that do, in fact, keep turtles out of the nets and reduce that mortality substantially. 1996 amendments, sea turtles are technically defined as fish, and have no specific regulations mentioned. But then in the 2006 amendments, sea turtles become defined as ecosystem components. There's bycatch reduction programs that specifically mention sea turtles. The Act states that they have to integrate practices with NEPA, and then we have turtle excluder devices mentioned in those amendments. Now, one thing that was mentioned yesterday and I think is important to bring up again is there are many benefits of the Magnuson-Stevens Act to marine megafauna outside of the US. The premise here is that countries who sell us seafood should abide somehow by the rules that we set for our fishermen. Keeping in mind here that imports, as we learned yesterday, 90% of seafood consumption in the US is imported. So there are a variety of laws that have stemmed from the results of Endangered Species Act litigation and also changes to the Magnuson Act that have led to rules about what other countries need to do in order to export their seafood to the US. And the most recent example of that is this emphasis on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries that's part of the amendments to the High Seas Drift Net Fishing Moratorium Act, and specifically focused on sharks and shark conservation in countries that export seafood to us. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked about vulnerable species and how the MSA protects them. Let's talk about habitat. This is the Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve in Oregon, and I like to show this picture as this is what Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve looked like before we declared it a marine reserve, and this is what it looks like after we declared it a marine reserve. And I think that's important to point out, especially when I'm talking to folks in Portland or other places where, you know, people who, I mean, it's not like walking through a reserve on land where you see big trees and lots of other amazing things in the habitat. I mean, you don't really get to see much. And you don't see a big change that takes place when an area has been declared protected. But there are we are monitoring changes in these reserves and protected areas along the US West Coast. underwater so we can actually see what's going on down there. And then habitats, of course, vary a lot when you actually get below the surface. We have habitats near shore, like kelp forests. We have deep water habitats. And then the subject of a lot of attention lately has been on biogenic habitat, the deep sea corals in particular, and where those are located and what kinds of impact bottom contact gear has on those ecosystems. So habitat, pre-1996, there was possibly some associated protections from MMA or Marine Minerals Act and the Endangered Species Act, but not really much going on with habitat prior to 1996. Then with those amendments in 96, we have promotion and identification and protection of essential fish habitat for managed species. And the important point about EFH is that it was defined as the habitat that's needed for all life stages of the fish, not just the adult fish that we typically capture. And then with the 2006 amendments and implementation, more promotion of essential fish habitat, and then a mandate for reporting on habitat status and quality. So essential fish habitat, because it's something that is, it has to be defined for all species, for all life stages, actually takes a lot of data. It takes a lot of ecological and biological information. And so it was a bit of a problem for the agencies and for the councils to figure out what information was available. And it's been kind of a slow process getting all of those pieces of information together to really figure out where essential fish habitat is and where the most critical places are. Now, what makes habitat vulnerable? Well, areas with slow natural turnover. So when we say vulnerable, remember we're specifically talking about vulnerability to fishing and fishing activities. So areas with low natural turnover are less resilient to the kinds of impacts that fishing gears may have on them. Very heavily fished areas that are subject to gears that smash stuff up do in fact become vulnerable habitats. Areas with very delicate biogenic habitat, things like deep sea corals and so on, are potentially vulnerable habitats. And then habitats are vulnerable when they have high impact from things like climate change or other stressors. And those other stressors may be man-made or not. So probably the biggest problem with habitat and protecting habitat is we still don't have a very good way to define critical habitat for most fishes. So by the time you figure out where fish occur in all life stages, the entire ocean is pretty much essential fish habitat, okay? The designation of what we call HAPSES, habitat areas of particular concern, are a good move forward from that. Because declaring the entire ocean essential fish habitat isn't really very useful from a management standpoint. So there's now more effort to identify areas that are particularly delicate, have high biodiversity, potentially higher productivity. But there's actually relatively little research still on habitat impacts of gears other than bottom trawls, okay? And then there's not really much research on habitat recovery. I was very excited to hear Jody's description of the project that they're doing with fishermen down south on the effects, the recovery effects after trawling in soft bottom habitats. But really not very much going on there. And what we really need to do in order to identify the areas of habitat that are most critical for fisheries is to find those areas that contribute the most to productivity, not just the areas of high relative abundance. So we have some work to do on that still. And unfortunately, not generally the funds necessary to do that kind of work. This is a little project I just wanted to show you that a group of 14 graduate students at OSU are working on with some help from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center folks. This is a heat map of fish richness on the left side there and invertebrate richness on the right side. And this is based on the trawl survey data from 2003 to 2010. And it's just a way to kind of get a broad picture of where are the areas where we have consistently higher biodiversity in space, and then also what is the variability of that biodiversity through time. So we can potentially use exercises like these that utilize the data that are being collected really for single species stock assessment and utilize them for asking other questions about that are more ecosystem based, like biodiversity, species richness, and so on in space and time. And that brings us to food webs. Okay, and food webs, and especially the recent emphasis on forage fish. I was involved with the Lenfest Forage Fish Management Task Force, and a lot of talk about management of forage fish, more conservative management of forage fish, and so on. So really the forage species come in under National Standard 1 in the definition of optimum yield. And if we look at the list of things that are under the optimum yield standard, you see these long lists of things that could be considered, okay? And I don't need to read them to you, there's a bunch. Species interactions, including food web trophic interactions. Considering managing the forage stocks with a higher biomass, and then considering other impacts such as ecological or environmental conditions that stress marine organisms. Well, this is kind of a long laundry list, really. A lot of things that you could potentially consider in the process of determining optimum yield. And I think we need a little reality check here. The Act and the national standards are very broad and inclusive, but they don't provide guidance on how to incorporate ecosystem considerations into management. And so that's a lot of what we talked about today, that David and others have been discussing in various working groups. How do we actually operationalize this and make it work? Is it simply going to lead to this mantra of fish less? In that case, well, I'm not sure that we need to do a lot of elaborate models. But at the same time, we're trying to base these decisions on science and come up with defensible levels. And probably the biggest problem, I think, with this is that it's kind of an unfunded mandate. There's not a lot of dollars going into the research that would be needed in order to determine the trophic interactions and so on. If the food webs out there can be simplified to something like this is an Antarctic food web, not that really focused, you see, on the marine mammals. And food webs and the construction of food webs always depend on the taxon of interest of the biologists who are putting them together, of how they group things. And the reality, though, is that food webs aren't this simple. They're more like this, right? And it's really difficult to think about how to take something that's this complex and turn it into a model that can actually give you quantitative and reliable and robust results. Okay? So we're getting there gradually, but it's going to take some time. And then probably the biggest problem is maybe you figure all this out, but then the system changes. Okay, so it's not even a constant system. And this food web that John Field worked on with Bob Francis and others was developed with data during a time when sardine, for example, were not very common in the system. And so sardine don't show up as a critical species. But now sardine are in the system, although they're on their way out again. But my point is that some species come and go and make it much more difficult to actually enumerate these food webs. So, and I just wanted to throw out this idea, because I was talking about the problem with unfunded mandates. The need for precise control rules for single species management really forces the agency to pour resources into single species assessments and leaves little time and funds for research on mechanisms of change and resilience and bycatch and habitat impacts. So, we've heard a couple people say, well, you need to pay for this if you want it, and don't take money away from the things we already need to do. You've got to add money to the system. Well, we all know how difficult that is right now. So we do have to think pretty hard about how we're going to get this done. All right, Another consideration is, what do we mean by sufficient to protect vulnerable habitats and species? Removal of large amounts of fish and invertebrate biomass by any means is going to impact the ecosystem. Okay? Reduced biomass of top predators or trophic changes are likely. Okay? Most fishing gears impact more than one target species. Okay? More than the target species, I should say. And we have to think about, well, how much change is acceptable? Is an acceptable amount of change just enough to avoid an increase in the risk of extinction? Or is it to maintain biomasses above some desired level? Or is it to avoid reduction in resilience to environmental change? There's lots of different ways we could think about this. And here's just an example from some of the Lenfest Forage Fish Task Force work. You see different species, groups of species on the x-axis here versus a change in biomass when sand eels are removed from the system, according to an ecosym with ecopath model. And you see that if we fish the stock down to 75% of its unfished level, you get about a 20% reduction in birds and mammals. If you fish it down to a 40% of B0 unfished level, then you get about a 50% reduction in birds and mammals. Is that acceptable? What's acceptable? Okay, what should those cutoffs be? All right, so I did want to come back at the end here to this question of depending on the ESA. I think the Endangered Species Act should be a law of last resort when extinction is likely. Because I think some of you will agree with me, once the ESA is invoked, all hell breaks loose in litigation and otherwise. Waiting until a stock, and now I'm going to take off my scientist hat, waiting until a stock is determined to be at a level, at that level, to take that level of action is, I think, an irresponsible use of natural resources. And then where's the burden of proof go? Okay, then it's up to the scientists, NGOs, whomever, to determine if extinction is likely. And then promoting activities that reduce catch of unwanted species and habitat impacts is a responsible use of natural resources. And I think the MSA is headed in that direction now. All right, that said, laws and standards should be prudent about when and how to invoke restrictions, considering a multi-step process of using simple models to evaluate vulnerability, and then looking at identifying which species could be subjected to some increased chance of going below a critical target. A big example for us right now on the West Coast is the rough-eye rockfish. It's a slow species, highly vulnerable from a life history standpoint. But if you look at the distribution of this species, it's really not very common in the southern end of the range here. So this is a species that's not going to be actually encountered very often. So invoking big restrictions because of this species in this area may not make a lot of sense. We need to look at this more holistically. All right. And then strong and prudent provisions in the MSA could reduce negative effects of ESA listings. This is a leatherback turtle wrapped up in drift net gear. And the example I want to give here is longline fisheries and sea turtles on the West Coast, US West Coast. Direct mortality in pelagic longlines is actually very low and can be reduced to nearly 0%. This is work that's been done by the Hawaiian longliners, pelagic longliners. Promoting a longline fishery on the US West Coast could promote a switch from drift net gear. And that, in turn, reduces overall bycatch of biomass per swordfish landed by 80 to 90%. So when you take all of the bycatch into consideration instead of a few key species, then you see a much different picture of what the more logical ecosystem-based approach would be. And then you could, promoting a domestic swordfish fishery could potentially lead to less reliance on imports. So maybe a stronger MSA in these regards to ecosystem-based management could lead to better decisions about the best ways to fish for certain species. All right, so just to wrap up, on paper, I think the MSA is sufficient to protect vulnerable species and habitats. It has a broad provision for protection and considerations of habitat and bycatch and forage species. There's an emphasis on bycatch reduction measures and incentives in conservation engineering. The NEPA EIS requirements may duplicate some efforts, but do provide some valuable accounting of impacts, and there is integration with other laws required. But in practice, it's a good start, but there's still some concerns. Vague guidance is there for setting optimum yield. Maybe we need that level of flexibility, but it also weakens things a bit. Insufficient resources for research, development, and implementation of tools for impact assessment, and the councils in NOAA will continue to be pushed by special interest litigation, which may not always be focused on the most pressing needs or ecosystem-based approaches. So my little bits of advice here, just to wrap up, increase funding if you increase mandates. I think most of us here would agree with that. Support fishery independent data collection and biological and ecological process research, and observer programs, very critical. Broaden the membership of fisheries science and management advice. I think if more of us marine conservation biologists spent some time working with the councils, we would probably all get along better. Support incentives for fishermen to avoid bycatch and habitat impacts, and develop defensible and reasonable rules for incorporation of ecosystem considerations in OY. Thank you very much.